As the pressure of the barbarians increased, the Roman emperors grew more despotic while their citizens grew more impoverished. Why did the empire finally run down? Or should the question be, why did it last as long as it did? The fall of Rome, this time on the Western tradition.
And now UCLA professor Eugene Weber's continuing journey through the history of Western civilization.
Last time we talked about the barbarian tribes which contributed to the decline of the Roman Empire, and also about the measures the emperors took to oppose them, which led to further decline. But when you talk about the barbarians, you have to put them in perspective. The population of the empire in the 3rd and 4th centuries was only between 50 and 65 million people, and this was for a realm that ran all the way from the Tyne River in northern England to the Euphrates. So the barbarians were able to have an impact far beyond their numbers. Tribes of Germans and Huns might vary in size between 50,000 and 100,000 people, which meant between 5,000 and 20,000 warriors. But the indigenous populations were also small, and so were the Roman armies. As soon as one gang of barbarians was eliminated or assimilated, another came along, and then another. Some of the Roman emperors tried to position their troops so that they seemed to be everywhere at the same time, but this wasn't always an easy trick to pull off. After mid-3rd century, when the barbarians were everywhere, urban life changed radically for the worse. Towns used to be large, open centers of life and culture. But as you can see from this plan of a Roman town in Silchester, England, now they contracted and turned into fortified enclosures. You can still see the general lines of the town today. Extremely compact and easy to defend. Even a major city like Bordeaux shrank to 70 acres or so during this time. Life in these fortified towns became so dreary that the aristocrats deserted them for their country estates and built large fortified villas like this one. They hunted, they feasted and entertained their neighbors, and they developed the sort of rural life that would be normal for lords or country gentlemen for the next 15 centuries. In this context, the large landowner became a little local king. He didn't bother to pay his taxes, and no one could make him. He paid his own guards and men-at-arms. He administered the law on his estates and built his own prison and fed and protected his clients, who were really his subjects. And so, by the 4th century, the basis of the medieval economy and of the feudal system to come was pretty much in place. You can also see the breakdown of Roman civilization reflected in the arts. Statues of emperors and other great men were now made in 2 sections. A standardized body that could be imitated and shipped anywhere, and a particular head which tended to look more and more like a shepherd who has eaten his sheep. and the classic calm had given way to a pathetic expressionism. The elegant naturalism of Hellenistic art had been replaced by cruder figures, still classical, but stiffer, rougher. More important, there was a decline in the competence of the emperors, which was bound to be serious in a system in which the emperor was everything, where the emperor's capacity and will were crucial. And in fact, under both Republic and Empire, Rome had a fundamental institutional problem: the inability to adjust institutions to the scale and the nature of changing realities. When the Republic got too big to handle, the Romans adjusted to it by accepting the personal government of Augustus and his successors. Nothing was codified, nothing was regulated. It was left to chance. And sometimes chance served Rome well, and sometimes it didn't. On the whole, most of the 2nd century was a lucky break, because the murder of this man, the despotic Emperor Domitian, in 96 AD, opened the door to a succession of first-class rulers. Nerva, Trajan, Hadrian, Antoninus, and Marcus Aurelius. But then Marcus Aurelius placed family feeling over logic in naming his successor. In 180, his son Commodus became emperor, a teenage megalomaniac who thought he was Hercules. He sacrificed to the gods large numbers of gladiators and beasts. He kept a harem of 300 female concubines and as many males, and he was finally assassinated. Good riddance. Commodus, depicted here as Hercules, opened a series of regimes in which brutish efficiency alternated with more or less absolute madness. It was a time when personal oppression could only be remedied by personal initiative, mainly in the shape of rebellion and murder. And since neither murderers nor victims could measure up to the immense problems the empire posed, things were bound to fall to pieces eventually. Part of the reason why it took so long lies in the maxim of Septimius Severus, who was emperor from 193 to 211. Severus told his sons, "Be united, enrich the soldiers, and scorn the rest." This was good advice, but it couldn't keep his son Alexander from being murdered by conspirators in his own army, and it couldn't prevent his grandson Heliogabalus from turning into a homosexual eccentric who gave himself up to debauchery. Heliogabalus became emperor in 218 at the age of 14, and he ruled only 4 years. He made the mistake of forgetting to pay his soldiers enough attention, and he was killed by his own Praetorian guards in a barracks latrine in a plot hatched by his own family. In fact, the whole 3rd century appears as a very dark period in the history of the empire, a period of anarchy during which the Praetorian Guard and the provincial armies contended to place their respective candidates upon the imperial throne, the office of emperor being auctioned off to the highest bidder. Behind this decay, there were also important social divisions. From the beginning of the 3rd century on, the army consisted almost entirely of peasants from the less civilized parts of the empire. and these peasant soldiers were in violent opposition to the urban middle classes who had provided the leadership in the Augustan Empire. So a struggle developed between a barely Romanized provincial army and the civilian elements of the population who were mostly Roman and who were trying to keep the peasant soldiers from taking over. The situation was further complicated by the fact that each legion had been made responsible for its own recruiting. Remember that most of these legions were permanently quartered on the frontiers, which meant that they would naturally draw recruits either from their immediate locale or else, and even more likely, from barbarians across the borders. Now, this system de-Romanized the army even more, and it produced strong local tendencies that you might call nationalist. Soon, the army of Gaul or of Illyria wanted its particular leader as emperor and no longer felt the old sentiment of imperial patriotism for a cosmopolitan kind of Rome. And this, in turn, accentuated the conflict for political power in which all the frontier armies were engaged. Out of this century of chaos, there came a militarized empire and a pretty straightforward despotism under Diocletian at the end of the 3rd century, and then under Constantine at the beginning of the 4th. All this time, lip service was paid to the old Roman traditions, but in reality, the government was carried on by members of a military caste. The emperor was a soldier, and he appointed only soldiers to positions of authority in the central and the provincial administrations. This created a purely military aristocracy and one that was continually reinforced by barbarian recruits. So the later empire was really an oriental monarchy with the trappings of a police state, a realm in which the citizen body no longer pursued its own ends, but became merely the exploited appendage of its so-called defenders, the legions. This is how a historian, J.W. Thompson, described the court of Diocletian. The emperor was a god and moved as an absolute sovereign reigning by divine right. It would be almost true to say that the Roman world trembled at the emperor's nod. The greater the barbarian pressure on the empire, the greater justification there seemed to be for this kind of despotism, social regimentation, extortionist taxation. But the more extreme the later emperors were in this direction, the more they centralized power, the more outrageously they taxed, the less Roman civilians felt they had to defend, the more they came to accept the coming of the barbarians almost as relief. At least barbarians didn't tax. It has always been a problem for a society faced by a serious challenge to decide just what measures it can take and how far it can go in opposing and meeting that challenge. If you argue that you can only preserve your way of life by adopting certain means which negate that way of life, that you can only preserve democracy or free speech by limiting them, for example, or preserve a high standard of living by taxing and restricting it, or preserve liberty by regimentation, or moral order by inquisition, then you run the risk of sacrificing exactly the things you say you are fighting for. You run the risk of sacrificing precisely those things that you use to justify the sacrifices in the first place. And you risk becoming so like your enemy that the differences matter very little. In the case of Roman society from the 4th century on, most of the civilians were less well off than the barbarians across the Rhine, especially if we set aside the small educated aristocracy leading a rather precarious existence in provinces like Gaul or North Africa. As for the soldiers, they were the barbarians. By the 4th century, the old Roman legion was no more, and the barbarian infantry serving as Roman soldiers didn't have the discipline to execute complicated maneuvers. In 378, the Emperor Valens led a Roman army that was almost annihilated at Adrianople by the heavily mailed cavalry of the Goths, and Valens was killed. This was probably the worst defeat the Romans had suffered since the days of Hannibal 6 centuries before. And the most important result of it was that the Emperor Theodosius, who succeeded Valens, decided that the infantry had become obsolete, and he hired in its place precisely the Gothic cavalry that had shown it to be so and that had settled in Roman lands anyway after Adrianople. With this act, the corpse of Roman military tradition was formally buried, and the system that replaced it produced the Gothic warlords and their heavily armored cavalry. These were the soldiers who would supervise the dismemberment of the Western Empire in the 5th century. So it can be argued that the Roman Empire, which had been built in the first place by the Roman legions and the Roman farmers who fought in them, was bound to fall to pieces when the small independent farmer was extinct and the legions decayed partly for lack of him. After that, the soldiers we call Roman were all barbarians paid to fight other barbarians. Even high generals and officials running the state would themselves be barbarians, like the general Stilicho, a Vandal who was Emperor Theodosius's son-in-law. In 402, Stilicho moved the imperial court to Ravenna in the northeast, where it would be safer behind the marshes and where it would find it easier to escape by ship if the enemy got too close. So Italy was no longer a safe place for Romans. Rome itself was a sitting duck. And indeed, within a few years of the move to Ravenna, the inconceivable happened. In 410, an army of Goths under the command of Alaric, their king, entered the city and sacked it. The fall of Rome was the symbol of the fall of a whole civilization, the end of its security, however imaginary it was by then, and the end of a whole way of life. The world one lived in could no longer be taken for granted. Saint Jerome, writing from Jerusalem, commented, "If Rome can perish, what can be safe?" So the end had finally come, and the search for the reasons why began. A search that would fascinate countless generations of historians. Messy politics over the succession of emperors was one reason. So was declining military power, and of course economic strangulation. But there was also a process of sociological decay, which gradually destroyed the foundations of the Roman Empire's strength. And this was in effect the victory of the Oriental model of despotic monarchy over the Mediterranean city-state, and the decline of Rome's urban citizen class under the pressure of that Oriental-like centralization and bureaucracy. To understand why that happened, we have to keep in mind that the Roman Empire had never possessed a really homogeneous culture. After it spread out of Italy, the empire was an artificial union of alien social organisms which had been largely brought together by an amazing effort of military and administrative organization. But it was a shotgun marriage, not a love match. In the eastern part of the empire, Rome inherited the debris of Oriental and Hellenistic monarchies. In the west, Rome conquered and assimilated the tribal societies of European barbarians. Although there was a community of culture between cities, the Hellenistic cities of the east and the Latin cities of the west, this unity was superficial and it was mostly limited to a privileged class. It was a society of consumers based on slave labor and on the exploitation of subject classes and subject peoples. As soon as this privileged class was ruined by the economic crisis of the 3rd century and by the loss of its political privileges, the underlying differences between the eastern and western parts of the empire emerged as strong as ever. As it turned out, the West disintegrated totally and only the East survived with its firm base at Constantinople. And that was because the Eastern Empire was more compact and better able to defend itself, but also because the autocratic traditions of the East, even though they destroyed Rome's urban citizen class, were still better suited to running an empire than the decentralized, divisive tribalism of the West being revived by the incoming barbarians. Remember that long before Rome declined, the solution to the anarchy of the late Republic days had been found by appealing to Eastern ideas, one-man rule, God, kings, and all the rest. The Augustan restoration wouldn't have been possible without it. And when Constantine reorganized the Eastern Empire in the 4th century, he made it a sacred monarchy united by religion and based on a hierarchy of clergy and officials. In other words, he led a return to the underlying social and political tradition of the ancient East. In the provinces of the West, however, this tradition was absent. The Western peoples had more in common with the warrior tribalism of the North, with men like this, a Dacian from north of the Danube, than they did with the theocracy of the East. And so eventually the leadership of Western society fell into the hands of barbarian chieftains. Of the greatness that was Rome, only ruins and memories and myths were going to survive in the West. All this took a long time to happen, of course. Even before Rome passed on the torch to Constantinople, she lasted far more centuries than the United States have lasted so far. So perhaps the question shouldn't be, why did the empire come to an end? Since all ancient empires explode or collapse when they get over a certain size and a certain age. Instead, we should probably ask, how come it lasted as long as it did? And there, your guess is as good as mine. Perhaps the long, desperate resistance of emperors and generals and ordinary people may have had something to do with the belief that the Roman Empire represented the last empire, and that as long as the Roman Empire lasted, the end of the world would not take place. They believed that the empire was the last age of humanity. When it fell, that would be the end of mankind and the last judgment would be upon us. So there was good reason to keep it from ending. There was good reason to pretend that it was alive even when it was dead, and then to revive it as soon as possible, as it would be revived when Charlemagne was crowned a Roman emperor in Rome on Christmas Day of the year 800. And although the Holy Roman Empire of Charlemagne and his successors was neither holy nor Roman nor really an empire, it was going to keep the myth going another 1,000 years. But that's another story for another time.